All right, everyone. So in this video, we're going to be covering exposure. And in previous videos, I've already talked about your shutter speed, your aperture, and your ISO. I'll go over them again really quickly. So again, when we're talking about shutter speed, we're dealing with increments of time, and we're talking about the amount of time that the shutter is open during exposure. So we have our shutter speeds here, going from a full second, coming all the way to 1/2000th of a second. And remember that when we decrease the time of the shutter speed or the shutter open, decreases by half. And if we increase it by one stop, it doubles in time. The same function for aperture, right? So going from one stop more open in your aperture, you're doubling the light. And if you were to go from stop down or go from one aperture opening to the next, by closing your aperture, you're cutting it in half, right? And again, the lower numbers mean a larger aperture opening. The larger numbers mean a smaller aperture opening, and these also affect your depth of field. And then your ISO down here, this is going to be your film or your camera sensitivity, your camera sensor's sensitivity to light. And again, these functions in stop, right? So if we have a lower number ISO, the sensitivity is less. If we have a higher ISO rating, the sensitivity to light is more. And I just want to quickly define stop for you because I've been throwing this term around throughout the videos. And I just want you to really know what it is because it's going to be constantly used in your vocabulary when you're talking about exposure and your pictures. And so this references the measurement of light that strikes the camera's film or sensor during the moment of exposure. And so a whole stop as opposed to a half stop or a third stop, because we have those as well. A whole stop always refers to either decreasing by half or increasing by double. So it just means what we're doing when we move our shutter speed or our aperture or our ISO independently. Okay, so if you just are changing one of those during exposure, that is referred to as a stop. Okay, so again, it can be affected by aperture, shutter speed, or ISO. These are the components of your exposure as outlined in that exposure triangle on the other slide. And to add a stop of light means to double the amount of light exposed to the sensor or the film. And to subtract a stop of light means to cut it in half. So cutting the amount of light exposed to the sensor or film by half. Okay. So you may refer that this is like opening up or stopping down, okay, when you're talking about your aperture. But just know that that's what a stop means, okay? So going back here to our exposure triangle, we see we have the elements of exposure here. And in the middle here, I have this gray triangle, okay? And it's purposefully this middle gray because as we talked about in our metering video, whenever you consult your light meter, it's always reading for that middle gray, okay, that 18% gray. And if you need a refresher on that, you can refer back to the exposure video, okay? But the reason I have it in this triangle here is because these all work together, right? And if you think about a triangle, the triangle's angles at these corners always stay the same, but depending on how much you open up one side of that triangle, you're going to have to compensate by moving the other sides of the triangle, okay? But the angles are always going to equal the same. Okay, so in here I have for you a sample or an example of what your meter reading would be when you consult your light meter for a particular situation, okay? So here we say at ISO 100 down here, when you take your light meter reading for this middle gray of your composition, the meter is telling you at ISO 100 to get the correct exposure, you need to set your shutter speed to 60th of a second at 5.6. Okay, So that's kind of where you're going to start, right? So you can make adjustments accordingly, right? And if you were to say, okay, let's just throw this out there, for example, we're going to leave ISO 100 as a base. But let's say, for example, you're photographing a scene that you have your camera in your hand. You're like, well, I'm at 60th of a second, and I want to make sure that I don't run into any camera motion blur. I don't have a tripod, so I need to be able to make sure that there's going to be no cause of camera shake or anything like that, right? So in that case, what you want to do is you would want to bring down your shutter speed. Sorry, not bring down, but you want to make your shutter speed faster, okay? And so by doing that, you would have to change this on this side, the shutter speed. So we would go to 1/25th of a second, because we know at 60th of a second that you're going to run into those camera shaking problems. But at 1/25th of a second, that's not going to be an issue, okay? But in order to keep the same exposure, we have to change not only the shutter speed, but also the aperture. Because remember, when we're changing one element of our exposure, if we're changing it by a stop, so let's say we're going from 1/60th of a second to 1/25th of a second, what's happening is we're cutting the exposure in half, right? But in order to compensate, to make sure that we're keeping this middle gray here, this correct exposure, if we're cutting something down by half, we have to then go in and increase or double something, right? And so that looks like this. So in reality, if we were to cut our shutters or slow our, if we were to make our shutter speed quicker by half, we would have to compensate by doubling the amount of light that's coming into the aperture, okay? So these are called exposure equivalencies. So the exact same amount of light is striking your sensor with 1/60th of a second at 5.6 with ISO 100. The same amount of light is striking your sensor at 1/25th of a second at f4. Okay, and it can continue on like this. If we were to say, okay, we're not comfortable with 1/25th of a second, we want 250th of a second, then we could again do another exposure equivalency, cutting our time in half, but then doubling the amount of light that's coming through the lens. Okay, this is also the same, right? 500th of a second at f2. And then we can also go the opposite direction, right? So let's say if we were going to start at 1/60th of a second and we were okay making our shutter speed longer by double, then we could then cut our amount of light by half by going to f8. Okay, so it's a little tricky. There's going to be a fair amount of playing around you're going to have to do with this. But once you kind of grasp this concept of exposure equivalencies and exposure compensation, then it's going to come like second nature. And again, like what I said in previous videos, your shutter speed and your aperture, and to a certain extent your ISO as well, these are all tools for you, okay? So if we look at this next slide here, these are your exposure equivalencies. And thinking about these again as tools, let's say you were photographing, you're starting here in the middle at 30th of a second at f8, and you're like, okay, well, I kind of like what's happening here with these birds, but I really want to play with just the amount of motion blur that's going to happen when I have my picture made. You can, keeping in mind this this exposure here from your light meter, you can then compensate and get this exposure equivalency here by stopping down your lens. That looks like 4 stops, right? And then getting this larger depth of field, but then also the important thing here to note is that the exposure time or your shutter speed time is really long. It's 1/4 of a second. So that means during your exposure, you're getting this motion blur captured in your image. But you notice that the depth of field also is very large. You're seeing all the way through to this back of the composition. Let's say you're not into that and you're like, well, actually, I like the idea of stopping things in motion. No problem. You can change your shutter speed again here. Instead of 30th of a second, now we're at 250th of a second, which is a quick shutter speed. You make the image, and the birds are all sharp here, and you're like, I kind of like that better, right? But what you sacrifice is this depth of field, right? So if you compare the backgrounds in all these images, you'll see that at f22, the background is sharp, versus at f4, our depth of field is really shallow, and the focus only really is falling on these birds here, okay? And so that's, again, your tools when you're making your pictures. Each of these images, although they're the same composition with the same subject matter, they all feel really different, based on the shutter speed used or the aperture that you're photographing at. So again, tools. They're always going to be tools for you. So that's exposure. I hope that's helpful, and I'll catch you in the next video.